Okay, so yeah, hi there everyone, and thanks to the organisers for hosting this scientific workshop. So my name is Dave O'Leary. I'm a final year PhD student from the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences at NUI Galway. My PhD, it's all about using large data sets to try and solve problems at a scale that is useful to people. We have an increasingly abundant number of such data sets, from bedrock and quaternary geology to soil maps. There's also been an increase in airborne geophysical surveys, and with the advent of freely available satellite data from the likes of the European Space Agency and NASA, I think we're in a unique place. We have a unique opportunity to become leaders in the field of big data for local problems. So with that in mind, I'm going to present to you some of my work on using airborne geophysical data to firstly define peatland boundaries and then to divide that peatland into areas of similarity, all done using modern machine learning methods. So some of the motivations. So peatlands, they're obviously important. They contribute to many ecosystem services such as biodiversity, biomass production, and flood retention. When peatlands are drained, negative environmental impacts include reduced surface water quality, a loss in biodiversity, and of course, greenhouse gas emissions. So conversely then, restored peatlands can return sites to being carbon neutral or even carbon negative, and this has the potential to play a large role in a country's overall environmental targets. Here in Ireland, of course, the importance of peatland has been recognised via the recent funding of restoration and rehabilitation projects nationwide. A problem facing any such project is that often peatland boundaries and the intra-peat variation are not well known. Boundaries are often defined by property lines as opposed to soil maps, and knowledge of how the peat might vary across a site is also not well known without an intensive ground survey or sampling campaign, which can be expensive and even dangerous given the size and remoteness of some of these peatlands. This can lead to inaccurate estimates of the amount of peat present and at various scales from individual sites to national inventories. So the two main motivations behind this work are, can we use radiometric data to get better estimates on peatland area when compared to current databases? And then secondly, can we look at that intra-peat variation to find zones of similarity within these peatlands? They're sort of the two questions I'm hoping to investigate and show during this talk, and as forming quite a large part of my PhD. So today I'm presenting this as a methodology, more so on a relatively small area. However, it does have potential applications at the national scale also. So previous work, both in Ireland and abroad, have used either radiometric, electromagnetic, or some combination of the two data to provide estimates of peat extent and peat depth. So I started obviously by researching these methods. In Ireland, you may be aware of the TELUS programme. It's been acquired by the Geological Survey, and it acquires the necessary data sets. So the means to conduct this study was in place. However, the methods presented, like I said, are potentially applicable internationally wherever these data have been acquired. I found from my background research that the assumptions on things like density, porosity, and saturation, as well as complicated links between the data and these physical properties in question, they're always present, as is the case with many geophysical studies. So another part of this work is to attempt to sort of simplify it by using these modern machine learning methods. So before getting into the specifics of the site, I just want to explain, what is the geophysics, and what method I'm using and why. So geological materials are naturally radioactive to some degree. In Ireland, as I'm sure we're all aware, radon is prevalent in many areas, and that's due to the natural decay of uranium in the ground. Other radioactive elements are present in near-surface materials, and a geophysical surveying technique called radiometrics aims to measure these. From the animation, you can see it's a passive technique. So as the airplane passes over the ground, it collects the data in the form of counts per second. Much like the frequencies of visible light, some elements decay within specific energy ranges, and therefore energies can be selected related to specific elements. These usually include potassium, thorium, and uranium, as well as total counts from within the full energy range. Different materials are composed of different combinations of these elements, so the method is often used for geological and sediment mapping. And as it's collected in counts per second, the resulting data represent an area over the surface as the plane moves. So then, why radiometrics and why peat? Or why in peat? Well, it turns out that radiometrics and peat have a special relationship, as peat is made up of mostly organic materials and it's usually not considered a radioactive source. Secondly, peat is very porous, and in here in Ireland especially, it has a high soil moisture percentage. Water acts as an attenuator of the radioactive gamma rays. It scatters them and, and stops them from reaching the surface. What this means practically is that the peat tends to act as a blanket to any radioactive signal from below. Mineral soils, by comparison, have a much more complex radiometric response. Their parent materials can act as a source, and they're less porous and generally contain less pore water. All this means that mineral soils will have a much higher radiometric signal, assuming the same underlying conditions, source conditions. So focusing back on the peat again, then, any radiometric signal that is detected within a peatland is the result of an initial source being attenuated by the physical properties of the peat, specifically the dry matrix density, porosity, saturation, and thickness of the peat. So armed with this theory, and now we have our freely available national data set from the GSI, can we potentially identify peat boundaries and then areas of similar peat within these boundaries without the need for extensive ground surveys? So the numerical techniques I'm using, they fall under the general heading of supervised and unsupervised machine learning. Supervised learning is where we take some examples of the data where we know the answer, we format it, pass it into a machine learning algorithm, and this results in a trained network or model. We can then take new data, format it as well, and then pass it through the same model and get an answer. So for this study, the question really is this data acquired over peat or not? Unsupervised learning is a little different, and that's where we're looking for patterns inside the data set. We allow the machine learning algorithm to determine which data are most similar to each other and then assign them to a cluster. In this animation, you can see the machine learning algorithm working as it breaks the data set into 3 distinct areas based on minimizing the distance in the data space between the cluster center, which is the big icons you can see moving around, and the little individual data points, or the little icons. So in this study, I take what we've now learned about radiometric data and its relationship with peat, and use supervised learning firstly to identify areas of peat over a site. I then use unsupervised learning to break those areas into zones where the radiometric data and by proxy the peat are similar. So we can look at the site now. So the site that was chosen for this study, it's a former raised bog in the Midlands of Ireland. It's been harvested by Borden Amona as an energy source for the local power plant, and it's just outside Shannon Bridge, which is there. The aerial image just shows the outline of it. It's a Gary Duff bog is what it's called, and the M6 motorway, just for reference, runs just up here, and Ballinasloe is up there. So the first image here is from the Corrine 2018 land cover database, and I've highlighted the area that it classifies as peat in yellow. This data is derived from optical satellite data and appears to highlight the peat on this site quite well. Next, we're looking at the Irish Soil Information System classification for this site, which again, I've highlighted the area of peat, and this time in green. These data are derived from multiple environmental variables, and it produces a probabilistic map of soils at 1:250,000 scale. The next database I looked at was the Quaternary Geology database, again from the GSI. And this is a database of a unit of soil within 1 meter of the surface that is 1 meter or more thick. So that's how they define their polygons in this. The area of peat is in blue, and this gray in the middle is marl. And the final image overlay is all the 3 current databases, and this just shows that none of them are the same. And so really any estimates of peat from this area is dependent on which data set you might use. So the radiometric data, this is just an image of that data as I saw it. So the data was acquired in June 2016, part of the TELUS A2 acquisition campaign, and it's located right on the edge of that survey, as you can see. So that's why it's cut off here at the top. The 4 radiometric data channels used in this study, and each data set was interpolated to a 50 meter by 50 meter grid, resulting in a total of 30,172 data points. There is a high fly zone, which you might see by this sort of area of noise here. And this is where the airplane has to climb above survey altitude, usually due to pasture areas or expensive horses or some infrastructure. And they have not been removed from this analysis. Areas of low signal are highlighted in dark colors and high signal in the lighter colors. And hopefully you can see that from what we've learned about radiometric data so far, that this appears to be an excellent tool for identifying peat boundaries. Previous published work has used the total count data, which is this here, and delineated peatland boundaries by choosing a value to represent that boundary. I hope to expand on this by attempting to objectively choose the boundary based on the data itself and the supervised classification that I mentioned. So, like I said, supervised classification, it's a machine learning method where we use labeled data to train an algorithm to identify these labels on new data. So for this quick study, I took 100 data points from within the Borden Amona site, which we can say with high certainty is peat, and I've labeled them as such. I've then taken 100 data points from outside the Borden Amona site, and they were not identified as peat by any of the other databases, and also from just looking at the radiometric data, they were all in a high signal area. So these 200 data points are my training data, and the supervised learning method looks to find that relationship between the 4 data layers and to build a trained model. The lower graphs are scatter plots showing the total counts along the bottom and the individual element counts on the vertical axis. And they can show a strong separation in the data space of the data labeled as peat, which is this red data, to the data labeled as not peat in the blue. And in this small example, it was actually 100% accurate and able to differentiate between the two. So this algorithm of these 200 data points can now be applied to the whole 30,000 plus data set points, and each data point can then be classified as either peat or not peat, and a spatial map produced. So here the image on the left of the screen is that spatial map with the radiometric data broken into areas of peat in brown and not peat in green. The image on the right is the exact same, but with the Corine land cover database overlaying for comparison. And interestingly, there are several parts of the map, this part specifically, which have not been highlighted, which were not marked as peat by any of the old legacy databases. Excuse me. So the advantage of using radiometric data to create this type of map is that it is a measure of the overburden through which it has passed. From what we know about radiometrics, the recorded signal is a combination of the initial source intensity and the attenuation properties of the overburden above it, with peat being a particularly strong attenuator. In contrast, the Corine map is derived from optical satellite data, which is basically the reflective properties of the surface down to maybe a few millimeters into the subsurface. And it may therefore not be able to identify areas of peat with grass or forest cover. The Irish Soil Information System and to a degree the Quaternary Geology maps are based on even less direct measurements and be considered probabilistic maps, or areas where peat in this case is most likely to occur. Again, the radiometric method presented here is a direct measurement of the subsurface and should provide more precise boundaries. There is disadvantages, of course, and the disadvantage of using radiometric data lies in its non-uniqueness. There's a possibility that very wet mineral soil or mineral soils over a low initial source of radiation might return a similar signal as is recorded over peatlands. However, by focusing on a smaller area such as this, we assume that the source intensity is relatively constant under the area presented, and it's probably true as the mapped bedrock in this area is all limestone. So the main motivation for this study, which was, can we use radiometric data to get better estimates on peatland area when compared to current databases? And this table at the top, I have excuse me, calculated the areas identified as peat from the legacy databases and now the radiometric classification method. And it shows that Corine might be underrepresenting the peatland inventory in the Midlands. And although reporting a similar area of peat to the Soil Information System and Quaternary Geology databases, the spatial distribution of the peat is quite different when using the radiometric method. So the second motivation was to investigate any intra-peat variation that might be present within the peatlands. As these variations are unknown, I'm using the unsupervised method, which acts without guidance, to find the similarities in the data and assign them to a cluster. In this case, I've only taken the data previously identified as peat, this little brown map down the corner. Excuse me. And the classification has shown that these data can be nominally described by 6 groups as shown on this map. As hopefully you can see, the groups have spatial coherency. They appear to show gradation of peat from within the site, from what I've called pure peat in cluster 6 in the middle to excuse me, edge peat identified as cluster 1. This gradation is shown within the data as increasing the relative radiometric signal from low in cluster 6 to a high in cluster 1. And intuitively, it makes sense. We'd expect the signal to increase as we move towards the edge of a peatland. So again, we assume the initial source of radiation is constant within this area. Then the differences in radiometric signal identified must be due to differences in the peat physical properties which govern the attenuation. And just, again, these are matrix density, thickness, saturation, and porosity. Therefore, the zones presented are showing areas of similar peat within a peatland. And the main use of a map such as this would be to guide any ground surveys or management plans for this site and allow representative guided sampling as opposed to an intensive or expensive auger campaign. Finally, the gradation of a peatland in this way may have implications for the carbon stock estimation, as intra-peat variations on thickness and density would imply variations in carbon stock across the site also. Now, just to finish up, I wanted to zoom into 2 areas and highlight the local differences between legacy databases and the radiometric method presented here. The first is this red box to the southeast of the site, and you can see the Corine database has identified this as peat, but also partially as coniferous forest. This again is because the database is derived from optical surface reflection. The Soil Information System and Quaternary Maps database both highlight these areas of peat, and the radiometric method matches closely with the legacy databases. And importantly, it shows that the radiometric data is not guided by vegetation, and you can see that the peat boundary clearly cuts through a forested area. Unsupervised clustering also shows that gradation from pure peat to edge peat, indicating there might be mineral mixing or just some change in the peat cover as we move to the edge. And the last one then, just to highlight a second area of interest, I've chosen this area to show excuse me, again, the advantage of using subsurface sampling methods such as radiometrics. Here, the Corine database identifies this area as mixed forest. However, all the other databases identify it as peat, with the radiometric method increasing the area of the peat compared to the other 2. This again shows how powerful a potential tool this is to identify areas of previously unrecognized peatland and possibly update the national inventory of known peatlands. So to conclude very quickly, a combination of airborne radiometric data and machine learning techniques has been used to firstly identify areas of peat versus non-peat on this 10 by 10 kilometer site in the Midlands. The areas were then compared to legacy databases and comparisons made with regards to the area estimation and spatial distribution. Secondly, these now identified peatlands are divided into areas of similar radiometric signal, and with the assumption that the initial source of radiation is constant, these zones must be related to the physical properties of the peat, and so the resulting map is that of similar averaged physical properties. Both results have implications for estimation of national peatland inventory and carbon stocks, and can be used to guide a more focused field campaigns or peatland management plans. Thank you very much.